You're listening to the Alberta Conservationist Podcast. I'm Mark Hall, your host. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society and Wild Origins Canada. Here we dive into inspiring conversations about hunter-supported wildlife conservation in Alberta, shining a spotlight as we go on the remarkable individuals driving these efforts. Get ready to explore the wild and discover the people making a difference in Alberta's conservation landscape. I think I've said this before on other podcasts. I heard it from a colleague, Dr. Adam Ford, out of UBC Okanagan in British Columbia, wildlife scientist there. He did a presentation one time kind of on moose across Canada, and he had this saying, might have even been the title of his presentation, all roads in Canada lead to the moose. That's figuratively speaking. And basically what it says is the moose is probably one of the most important animals to Canada as a country, and the Indigenous people that live in Canada, socially, economically, spiritually, and sustenance wise. It is definitely the most important huntable game animal in all of Canada. In my opinion as well. It's interesting because the moose occurs in every single province and territory in the country. This kind of comes up just a little bit into the bottom of Nunavut, not as extensive there as other provinces, of course. Newfoundland, Labrador, like they got so many moose, they're trying to manage their populations down. But for such an important game animal across the country, there are places in this country where moose populations are struggling, and there's places of the country where the populations are booming. The southern prairie provinces, when they switched over to canola as being a primary agriculture driver, it attracted moose farther south, and we see these, monster big bulls and stuff in places like southern Manitoba, standing in these beautiful yellow flower fields and whatnot. But so it's varied across the country, how moose populations are doing. Specifically, we're going to drill down on moose in Alberta and talk about some efforts that are being done on the conservation front for moose in Alberta. So we're going to learn all of that and the program that's taking place in Alberta from Bob Heyde. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Mark. Appreciate that.
So, first of all, we'll put in a plug for your project here. Look at that.
Looks beautiful. Looks beautiful.
And the hat. So where do you want to start? This is a project that Protect Alberta's cow moose that you it struck your heart. Obviously, I saw the presentation you gave in Edmonton at the Alberta Professional Outfitters AGM and conference, and the one thing that struck me is this was coming from the heart. It was something very, very important to you. So maybe start and pick up on your why. Why are you doing this project, and what is this project?
Mark, I'm going to just kind of go against your lead in there. I wanted to tell you that I have not been a podcast listener, but I have tuned in recently, and I want you to know that the podcast that you did on the crisis in Manitoba was the best podcast I ever listened to. And I also want
which would be the only one so far.
No, it wasn't the only one, but it was certainly the first one. And after I listened to your attempts to deliver a really well-balanced approach to the issue, I struggled in terms of what I had to contribute, because I thought you did a spectacular job.
So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean that in all sincerity. And this morning when I went to see the doctor to see whether he was going to suggest that I could live another year or not, I listened to your podcast on from September the 25th. That now means two that I've listened to on you. And some of the words that you quoted at the beginning of this one, I listened to this morning already. So it's kind of interesting to look at my computer
Oh,
screen and see your face and hearing those same words come.
excellent, excellent. Was that the episode with Rob Olson?
It could have been. I can only remember
Was it
one name at a time, and yours was the one that I remembered.
what was it, a Manitoba one as well?
It was, yep, yeah.
Okay, okay, yep,
So,
yep.
my particular journey with this began about 2 years ago. I was applying for a moose draw in Alberta, and on the My Wild Alberta website, I noticed that on the left-hand side of the column, I could access information about draw statistics and harvest statistics and some of those sorts of things. And just simply out of curiosity, I decided I would look at one little piece of information. I wanted to know what the harvest was in the area that I live. And I've lived in this area since 1989. So if I can do basic math, that's 37 years. And when I saw the information, I was shocked. It looked terrible to me. So I backed up a year and I backed up a year and I backed up a year and I backed up to 2010. And I could notice a very distinct trend. It was getting worse with every passing year. At one point, about 25 years ago, I served on the board of directors for the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society. And one of my roles at that point was to monitor moose. And so I had access to data that went beyond 2010, and I could go back to 2005. And so I applied that data to what was available online, and I saw a very disturbing trend. It looked to me like the population harvests were crashing. And
So so
because
the so quick question. So the data you were looking at that you said was getting worse, was that the hunter harvest, or were you looking at population data,
nope,
or
so
you were inferring population from hunter
nope,
harvest?
and that's a really, really important question. It was the licensed recreational hunter harvest.
Okay.
Yeah,
And it's been going down when you looked at the data set.
and substantially so. So
Okay. Okay.
that's the area that I live in. And I thought, well, maybe it's just my area. So I looked at some areas north of me and east of me and west of me. And pretty soon I had found myself looking at the data from, let's say, the northern half of the province and even some areas in the south. And it was a bit frustrating because there wasn't necessarily a consistent pattern. I thought that the area that I was in was showing a steady decline. I thought that a number of the areas adjacent to me were showing a steady decline, and yet there were some other areas that didn't show that same data. So I I contacted the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society. They receive reports from the provincial government annually as terms of population estimates. This was harvest data, so I asked them for the for the population estimates, just to see if it correlated with what the harvest data was showing, and it was pretty much a match. Um, the the information in my area showed probably a population estimate that dropped from 2,000 animals 20 years ago to 500 animals. And some of the other areas that I had looked at in a little bit more depth showed about the same ratio. Moose numbers are 25% of what they were 20 years ago. So your question was that based on harvest data or population estimates? I covered two of those, and I thought maybe I could go to a third source, and so I asked for aerial survey data. I was part of the aerial surveys back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I had some of that data still, but I was able to access all of that as well. And there was two things that I learned from that. Number one, the harvest or the aerial survey data seemed to validate what the harvest data said and what the population data said. And secondly, there was a huge lack of data from aerial surveys. There are about 37 wildlife management units in northern Alberta, and 11 of them have been flown in the last 7 or 8 years. So 25 of them have no recent data. And when you looked at the areas that had been flown and the population estimates that they had prior to the year that they flew it, there was a huge discrepancy between what they had thought there might be and what they actually discovered a year later. So it really brings into question how valid that information is on those areas that haven't been flown for a long time. So you almost have to go to anecdotal type stuff, which nobody likes to do, but talking with other outfitters, with other hunters and stuff, what have you seen over the areas? And in the area where we live and where we outfit, I can say for certainty that over the last 30 years, I've noticed a drastic decline in that moose population.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's a very similar story to British Columbia. Different jurisdictions that have seen these substantial decreases in hunter harvest, from things like 5,000 moose a year harvested out of a region to less than 500. Over I'm just trying to remember like a 20-year span.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and just absences in population census data. If I remember right, learning this somewhere along the way, for moose, roughly every 5-year intervals is about the ideal for wildlife managers to have a a population estimate done from aerial flights. That's kind of it doesn't need to be every single year, but I think about every 5 years. So when you start seeing, a decade, 2 decades, which I have seen in British Columbia as well, it's kind of those are pretty big gaps.
It's very scary because I suspect that you and I as hunters believe that we have a government biology department that looks after that and that we can trust that. And when I saw the lack of information and that the information that I could validate myself and see that, that it made sense, it was going in a terrible direction. And it was interesting, Mark, because I looked at the provincial harvest data. In other words, what the total harvest was across the province. And in the last 15 years, that number was relatively constant. And so I thought to myself, how in the world does that make sense that you can have a crash of harvest in the north and still maintain a steady population harvest? So essentially what's happened is that much of the southern part of the province has taken up the slack with that. You were mentioning the moose and the canola fields and that. Those moose there have a huge advantage over the moose in the north, and their populations have blossomed where ours have crashed. So my concern with moose in Alberta is primarily focused on the northern half of the province. The southern half seems to be holding its own.
Okay, very, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, you throw some other factors in there too. Maybe, a little more favorable winters, in the south. And I think you mentioned this last year in December, also private land, more in the south, less in the north. So just kind of like general open access to moose hunting areas is a little bit more controlled in the south than the north. Whether or not those factors, come into it, probably more predators in the north than in the south. Maybe not, but yeah, it's interesting that you've you've looked at data, and then you have questions, and then you've kind of seen like some logical splits north to south, and those I think, from where I sit, make sense for a number of those reasons.
They do. It's also presented a unique challenge as well. If you're trying to motivate people, let's say in the southern half of the province, that we have a crisis with moose in the north, anybody from Edmonton south is looking at you like you have rocks in your head because moose are being killed on the highway. So
exactly.
That's a bit of a challenge that, and the other part of it is there is a lack of data. And when you stick your neck out and you try to make a statement, you want there to be science behind it that backs it up.
Mm-hmm.
And the science is typically aerial survey data or harvest data. The harvest data is a little bit easier. I mean, it's collected every year. Like you said, the aerial data, that maybe be a 5 or 6 or 7 year cycle, but the harvest data is something that's a bit more reliable because we picked it up every year.
Yeah. Now, an interesting thing about using hunter harvest numbers to infer the population of moose that these hunters are hunting. I'm always used to being asked the question, well, what was hunter effort or hunter success? Because that can actually tell us a little bit more. So just to clarify for folks, if I've been going into an area hunting moose, like let's just say my whole life. And when I first started, moose were fairly abundant, and it would take me 2 days to harvest a moose. Move forward 30 years and fewer moose. Now it might take me 10 days or 12 days before I get a moose. That's like a reasonably good metric of moose density in that area. Like it takes me a lot more time to bump into and harvest a bull. Of course, there's like policy changes, regulation changes in amongst that. But is there anything? Did you look at anything like that and glean anything from how hard it is for a hunter to get a moose now?
I didn't, Mark. There are some other factors that go in with that as well. For example, how many draws were given in a particular area. That'll have an impact on that. You might want to even look at what the weather was like during the prime of the rut, because that's going to have a big impact on it as well. And you're absolutely correct. On our survey data that we provide as outfitters, and I believe what we provide as residents as well, we have to indicate how many days we spent hunting. And that is a metric that would help to make their decisions. But again, I looked at things like in the unit just north of where we live, in 2005, the allowable resident harvest was about 198 bulls. That was their target for resident harvest. The harvest last year was 2. Now, you can look at whatever metrics you want,
Wow.
but when it has crashed that badly, and you see an area beside it that's crashed as badly as that, you recognize that you have a serious problem. And when I got to that point, that was probably sometime in it would have been probably sometime in July or August. That would be 2 years ago. I said to myself, am I watching the decline of moose in the same manner as what the buffalo did? Is it getting that bad? Is it possible that I could watch that in my lifetime? And it was a bit of a, I said to myself, somebody has to do something. And I looked around in the room and I was the only one there. So you sort of have to point your finger at yourself and say, well, if you think you know something, and if you think you could make a difference, then you bloody well better get after it. So I was very fortunate at that time. I have a number of outfitter friends that I have a lot of respect for. And when I start working on information gathering and that, I often touch base with them. And one of them, Don Lind, from just the other side of High Prairie, close to where I live, was coming home from Prince Rupert and saw a whole bunch of signs on the road. That's the cow moose signs, and I'm just going to put one of those right in front of the screen, like that. And he saw a website on the bottom of it, recognized what I'd been working on it, and he sent that information to me. And it was August the 24th. It was the day that the archery, just the day before the archery season started for us here, and 2 of our first hunters were just pulling into the driveway. And I got that email from Don, and I looked it up, and it was one of the huge motivators for me, I suppose, and this whole thing that I've been working on. There was an outfitter from British Columbia, Dan Simmons, who noticed moose populations in his area crashing a little over 10 years ago. And their situation was a little bit different. This was a deliberate attempt by the provincial wildlife managers of British Columbia to drop moose populations in order to help caribou recover. And Dan really didn't see how that meshed and lobbied the government to stop that and got nowhere. And I'm not sure how many years he fought and didn't get anywhere. But when he recognized that moose populations were the crash of the moose were impacting the First Nations people in the Williams Lake area, he got together with a number of them and they lobbied the provincial government, and that was the start of the Cow Moose Sign campaign. It was, to me, a wake-up call because Dan recognized the importance and the absolute necessity of having Native First Nations people involved with wildlife management and being a part of the recovery strategy. And when I saw that, and I had a chance to talk with Dan, and saw that the power that was available when licensed hunters and outfitters and First Nations people could band together to make a difference, an impact on moose populations, then I really dug my feet in and said, "Yep, we need to go in that direction."
Yeah. Okay.
I'm very fortunate in the sense that, in addition to being an outfitter for 30 years, I'm also a school teacher, and I spent most of my career teaching up here in Native communities, and so I had some good connections in the Native communities here, and I tapped into those, and I discovered my second best friend. That was Roy Auger, who's the harvesting coordinator for the Métis Settlement General Council. And I sent Roy the data that I had collected and the YouTube video that I had got from the folks in Williams Lake and a few other assorted bits and pieces of information. And Roy said, "Come and do a presentation to our harvesting committee." And so then Gina from APOS and I did a presentation there, and we saw a huge willingness in First Nations people to say, "Yeah, we can see what you're saying. We agree that in some areas there's a problem. And if in British Columbia they can make a difference by putting up signs and educating people about protecting cows and calves, we're 100% in favor of it."
Yep. Yep. So this is, you know, for folks, this becomes a tricky conversation because, you know, we have licensed hunters following hunting regulations, and we have Indigenous people in Canada that have constitutional Section 35 rights to hunt, which they can harvest, you know, any animal at any time of the year. Hunters, you know, are regulated. I know there's a few places in British Columbia that have incredibly robust moose populations, and that's where the caribou thing comes in, like in the North Revelstoke Valley, highest density of moose in all of the province. With that comes a burgeoning wolf population. And with that comes a high impact of wolves on the endangered caribou. So with high densities of moose, the government is able to give licensed hunters cow moose tags to say we need to not reduce the population, we need to level out the growth of the moose population to level out the growth of the wolf population in return to take a little bit of pressure off the caribou. It's been working very well in that valley, but probably, you know, the same as in Alberta or Manitoba or wherever, these isolated little moose population areas where the population is growing, you know, and doing well, is a small portion of the landscape, a small portion of the overall moose populations. and that's where, you know, the one size doesn't fit all. And this is where it becomes, I guess, sort of, you know, socially and culturally kind of a tricky issue, is when you have areas where the moose population isn't doing well, but you have Indigenous communities that have the right to kind of hunt and harvest cow moose. What has been your experience talking to those folks saying, you know, the goal in recovering moose population is to not harvest cow moose?
Interesting. It takes a lot of legwork to get out and reach the people that you need to make this work. And for the last year and a half, I guess that's what I've dedicated myself to doing, is to spreading the word about this and trying to spread the information. Lots of challenges, and whether it's from First Nations people or resident hunters or even outfitters. The first challenge is that there's not solid data.
Okay.
We don't know what moose populations are in the north because we don't survey properly or haven't surveyed regularly. We don't know what the harvest is because we know what the outfitting harvest is and we know what the recreational licensed harvest is, but we have no idea about Aboriginal and First Nations harvest. So we really don't know that. And those are incredibly important pieces of information if you're a wildlife manager. It boggles my mind that in the year 2026, somebody is being tasked with the job of saying how many moose somebody can shoot in one of the units around my area as a licensed hunter, because they have so little data to work with. They're basically throwing darts and hoping to hit a target that's all over the map. So before I can I can feel like I'm making an impact on any of the Aboriginal communities, it has to be with the understanding that it's not a problem that's homogenous across the entire province. It's localized, like you said, but if you just open up the hunting map and look at the northern half of the province, you get a pretty well connected set of numbers to work with there. Um, it doesn't matter who you would talk to. If you're going to ask somebody to surrender something that they've been doing that's of importance to them, that feeds their family, if you're going to ask people to give up something of that importance, you better have a pretty big promise at the end of doing it. There better be a reason to do it. There better be something that makes sense to people. And again, not having the data makes that a bit of a challenge, but most people can see that the numbers in these areas are going down, and whether you have a historic right or you have a outfitting right or you have a licensed hunter right, if you have those rights and there's no animals there, it does you no good.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Now, in the different groups that you're working with, so we've kind of identified you have Indigenous people, you have outfitters, and then you have your resident harvest. Was there any like differences in people's sense of the moose populations in the lands that they're familiar with? Like, were you like talking to a First Nations community and they're like, what are you talking about? We got tons of moose. Or was it kind of like, yeah, we're all seeing the same thing here? Like, are you starting from that common base, or are there some like gaps in what people think is out there?
Yeah. So another really good question. If you were a resident hunter and you put in for an area, let's suppose you got drawn every 5 years and you went there 10 years in a row and you had a really difficult time getting a moose, would you go back there? Not
Yeah.
likely, right? You'd probably apply for a different area. And if you're a
Yep.
First
Yeah.
Nations,
100%.
if you're a First Nations harvester and you find that the area up around Wabasca's been depleted, you're probably going to go somewhere else. If you're an outfitter, your allocations are based on one area and you can't leave unless you buy permits somewhere else. So to have the consistency of having seen things over a significant period of time, it's a little harder to find people who have that background, who have that accuracy to it.
Okay.
But overall, many of the First Nations people that we've met with have noticed the same thing. And I want to correct you on the branding of what we would call First Nations people in Alberta. We have probably three separate and very distinct groups. We have the First Nations people who are members of treaties. We have the Métis Settlement General Council people who represent the 8 Métis settlements, and then we have the Métis Nation of Alberta who represent people with Métis lineage or heritage.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Very, very similar across, like going east across Canada, the groupings of people. Absolutely.
Not quite, because I believe Alberta is the only province in the country that has the Métis settlements, the Métis Settlement General Council. There are 8 Métis settlements.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I believe they're the only ones. That's what Dave Lamouche, the chairman of the Métis Settlement General Council, told me last year.
Okay, no, that's a fair point. I know, like where I live, there's a Métis association here, But when it comes to, like, I think it's the Rocky Mountain Métis Society or Association, British Columbia is unique in the Western provinces that the province here has never recognized Métis harvesters as having rights in the province. They do have to purchase hunting license is like the rest of them. So
is that right? I wasn't aware of
yeah,
that.
yeah, because the homeland where Métis people, essentially gathered their rights from, or where their rights come from, doesn't go west of the Rockies
I see.
into
Okay.
British Columbia. But there's a lot of work or going in a rabbit hole, but to kind of assert some rights there, that there were Métis settlements in British Columbia prior to a certain time, so on and so on. But yeah, anyways, it's fair point there. And of course, as we go north in Canada, then the other distinct cultural group is the Inuit.
Right, and I should mention as well, because um, I have neglected that part. There is a small Inuit community in northern Alberta as well that has that
Oh,
separate
okay.
distinction as well.
Okay, that's a new lesson, new piece of knowledge for me. Interesting.
Yeah, and it was for me too. Yeah.
Now, what? So let's transition, if it makes sense to you, to your actual program. You showed us a sign. What's the actual initiative when you're talking to people to say, hey, we need to do this thing? What is that?
So I'm going to point my fingers at my hero, Dan Simmons from British Columbia.
Okay.
A man with a vision, and a man who said, I'm not waiting for the government to solve my problems. I'm going to take this initiative on myself. And he decided that the best way for moose to make a recovery in British Columbia or to remain stable was to educate people about the importance of the cow moose and the calf. And so his sign program is geared towards helping people understand, number one, moose populations in many areas are in decline. And number two, the way for us to bring that decline, or to reverse that decline, is to allow cows and calves to survive. So there's no blame association. There's no faults. There's no finger pointings. It's simply saying to people, what can we do? What can I do? How can you learn about what's happening with the moose in your area? And if you're seeing the same thing that we are, and most people, as you would know, Mark, are quite oblivious to what harvest data is, or what moose populations are, or bull cow to calf ratios, or all those sorts of things. We assume that that's being looked after by the provincial government. But if people can take a little bit of time and discover for themselves that, yep, we have a bit of an issue here, or maybe a really big issue. And for most folks that hunt in the same area over a long period of time, they'll see that. And the first step with the Cow Moose Sign campaign is to let people know that there's an issue. You were at the presentation that I did at APOS in December, and I was frustrated with how few outfitters seem to be aware that moose are in crisis. Those people make a living doing that, and they should be the ones who are most concerned. And I was shocked, quite frankly, at how little discussion had taken place at our AGM. But that's part of the program, is to help people understand it. I found a really helpful piece of information, and I know that you would have seen it on the data that I presented at the APOS AGM, was the impact that one cow moose can have over the course of her lifetime. It's put out by the Alaska Fish and Game Department, and it's a well documented sheet of information that's easy to read, that shows what happens over a cow moose's period of 18 years of her life, and when she starts to breed, and when she starts to give birth, and all of that information is provided. And it was shocking to me that if a cow moose was allowed to survive her entire year, and all of her offspring were allowed to survive their lifetime, by the time that she hit the end of her life, there would be 212 moose there. That's obviously zero mortalities and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of kind of a theoretical thing because it's, factors out winter severity, factors out natural predation, factors out
But they
interspecies competition,
also take the next
disease.
step and they factor in that sort of stuff. And they basically go with a
Okay.
50% calf mortality. And at the end of her life, again, at the age of 18, she would have 66 offspring.
Yeah.
So it's a very significant number. And when I've showed that to people in the presentations that I've made, this is why a cow moose is so important, is because she can have these many offspring. And it's staggering to most people. It's quite shocking.
Yeah, there's been fairly similar there are graphics that have been put together on this on mountain goats because as you know, pretty much anywhere in Western North America that has mountain goat hunting, because of the challenge of telling a billy from a nanny that you're allowed to harvest any, but the emphasis on, here's the way to tell the difference, because if you accidentally or on purpose harvest the nanny, this is the long-term implications to the population. Very significant. Same with grizzly bears, as well. The certain species of animals out there, harvesting females of the species can, at any sort of significant level, has the potential to make the population and hunter harvest unsustainable. So,
and the one of the challenges again that comes with presenting this campaign is that there are places in Alberta where the harvesting of cows and calves is a necessary tool. It's absolutely. Where my brother-in-law lives down out in the Camrose area there are so few predators. The harvest by residents is strictly controlled. It's all private land. It's difficult for anybody to get access there. And if they don't harvest cows and calves, they will very quickly have a problem because there's limited habitat. They will overpopulate. So when you bring the message that it's really important to protect cows and calves, people who would buy into that want to know, where's the line where it's okay not to harvest and where we shouldn't harvest and where it's okay to harvest. And that becomes tricky too, because if you were to draw such a line, just on the other side of that line where it would be okay, now that area is going to get a tremendous amount of pressure because it can't.
Okay.
So the whole strategy of it gets very. You really have to have some good, serious management discussions if you're going to make a proper decision about that. However, it is very feasible for all of us to sit back right now, take a deep breath and say, if we are having a problem, and I believe we are, otherwise I wouldn't have spent all this time working on it. If we have a problem, what's the first thing that we can do that we can all agree to? And the first thing that we can all do is stop the harvest of cows and calves. And that's simply the message that I'm promoting. In listening to your podcast this morning, there was a discussion about utopia. If we were to implement this cow moose sign campaign, and in 10 years have a moose population that was robust and healthy and needed some changing, harvesting regimes, how do we amalgamate the 5 different interest groups in Alberta who all want a piece of the moose puzzle? I'm not smart enough to come up with an answer like that. There has to be some pretty good discussions going on with that, and it has to be really open-minded and very broad. But I am bright enough to figure out that if we don't stop what we're doing right now, we won't have to answer that question. We have to stop the harvest right now and give those animals a chance to recover. And in that time when they're doing that, then we can come up with a discussion on how to resolve the other issue.
Yeah. And I mean, definitely it's one of those ones like, which problem would you rather have, trying to stop a declining animal population, game population, or you've got a burgeoning population that if the brakes aren't put on them, they're going to eat themselves out of house and home, and then they're going to suffer a die-off, and usually a catastrophic die-off in a winter, like you lose 50% of your animals or some, crazy thing. This is where hunting comes in, and you can keep that, game population at a threshold that doesn't mean they're going to eat themselves at a house and home. And a lot of the game populations across Europe, roebuck, red deer, those species, the wild pigs, Eurasian wild boars, that's how they're managed. And if they're at the carrying capacity, like there's just enough food for the numbers of animals, the way wildlife managers keep that from becoming a problem is they allow hunter harvest and they focus on female harvest, because you can harvest all the males you want and your population can still explode and the animals eat themselves out of house and home. So they emphasize, same with white-tailed deer in the States. The folks at the National Deer Association like to see state by state harvesting more antlerless than bucks, because they know they're keeping their populations kind of at sustainable levels. So yeah, that would be the probably the better scenario, where the groups sit around the table and go, folks, we got way more moose than we need. They're getting slammed on the highways and the rail cars. We need all of you. How are we going to work this out? As opposed to, we've got to start taking away from people because we need to stop a decline. So that's where you want to get to, I assume, is that point where we're going like, hey, we got a lot of moose now. We've sacrificed for 2 decades. Now we got a lot of moose. Let's talk about allocation.
Yes, and I don't think it's going to take a 10-year or a 10-year sacrifice. But I'm almost 70 now, and I think I'd be. My doctor says I shouldn't plan to live, too much longer. So I don't anticipate that I'm going to have to go through the burden of trying to come up with a program on how we divide that. It would be very daunting to try to think of that. It's not daunting to think about stopping the harvest of cows and calves, and that by itself is a monumental program. It takes a lot of effort, and I met up with a fellow from the Whitecourt area. It'll be 6 months ago, who, like myself, was concerned about moose numbers and was operating independent of the government and independent of another agency or whatever, and had contacts within the First Nations communities, as well as the Alberta Wildlife Federation people. And we've joined forces in some significant ways, and have committed to trying to bring this message of the Cow Moose sign campaign to every place that we can in Alberta, and to try to get buy-in. So it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of communications and a lot of meeting with people. It takes a little bit of money, but it takes far more people that are willing to go out and pass that message along. And I think we've done our best to try to touch the 5 major harvesting communities in the province of Alberta, and we're gaining momentum. I talked with Dan Simmons from British Columbia about 2 weeks ago. He would have died to have been in the position that we're at after 2 years of working on this. And we're nowhere near where we're hoping to be. But we've made a number of uh, demonstrations, or a number of presentations, I guess is a better word, the one I'm looking for, to First Nations communities, both Métis and First Nations. And we're lining that up for the Alberta Wildlife Federation as well. Recently we met in Saddle Lake, and we met with the Saddle Lake Band members, chief and council. Saddle Lake is the second biggest reserve in the province, and we had members from the Canadian Wildlife Federation there, the Alberta Wildlife Federation, from the Métis Nation of Alberta, from Treaty 6, from Treaty 7, from Treaty 8, outfitters, recreational hunters, just a whole group of people. And it was a remarkable thing, because there was not one person from the Alberta provincial government there. As you are aware of the struggles that BC's provincial government is having in the Aboriginal communities, so too in Alberta with the separatist movement, we're having those struggles as well. And one of the fellows that works for the provincial government, that's a member of our parliament, our legislature, is an outfitter. And when he and I discussed this Cow Moose sign campaign in December at the AGM, I said, it might not be the place for the provincial government to be involved in these sorts of things. There's not a lot of trust. There's some hostility. If there can be a grassroots movement from First Nations people and outfitters and resident hunters, that could be very powerful. And we might be able to sidestep the challenges that would be faced by having the provincial government involved and make even faster progress.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. I'm always a support of, the bottom up approach to solving these problems. Nobody, likes a lot of the top down approach because they're always skeptical. They think they're going to lose things. I heard from an Indigenous person one time that said and you touched on this earlier, we don't really know what Indigenous communities are harvesting, what they need on an annual basis, and they're not required to report those numbers. And I remember the lesson that was conveyed back to me is like, we have hundreds of years of history in this country of when we open ourselves up to a government in this country, we lose. So there is a reluctance, as I understand it, with some nations, not all. They don't want to share what their communities are harvesting for their sustenance needs because they're scared the government's going to go like, oh, well, that's too much, and we're going to claw some of that away from you. So there's a legacy there. There's a history of mistrust, which, I'm sure probably plays in here, a little bit when you start talking about harvesting numbers.
You're absolutely right, Mark. And when it gets to that point, please God, where we'll be able to see the moose recover, that we have to make some, big decisions about that. It's going to take people with great wisdom and real courage and a vision to be able to make those kind of decisions. I have an 85-year-old neighbor who dropped off some history books of the area that I live in, which happens to be very close to where Treaty 8 was signed on the north shore of Lesser Slave Lake. And although I'm a teacher by profession, I have done a very poor job throughout my life of reading. I'm quite embarrassed by that because I actually enjoy reading. I just haven't allowed myself the time to do it. And this winter, I spent a lot of time reading about this area and about the signings of the treaties and the exploration of the North. When the treaty was signed in 1899 on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake in Gruard, the First Nations communities here were absolutely adamant that harvesting, and it was not just hunting, but fishing and trapping, because I didn't realize what a food source the beavers supplied, for example. So those three things, hunting and fishing and trapping, absolutely had to be critical or mandatory in terms of any kind of a treaty signing. And it only makes perfect sense because that was their grocery store. They didn't have someplace else to get anything else. So in those days, which was 127 years ago, it made perfect sense to include hunting, harvesting, fishing, trapping as a part of the treaty. Nobody would have hesitated with that. At the same time, when those discussions took place, there were under 4,000 people who signed either as Métis for script or as treaties, First Nations people for treaties. There were under 4,000 people in this northern part of the province, which basically was Treaty 8 territory at this point. Would they have signed the same arrangement knowing that 125 years later there would be 20 times that many people? Would they have thought, yep, we should be able to hunt and fish for forever, and don't see a problem with that? Would they have made those same arrangements knowing that people now can use drones, they can use aircraft, they can use quads, side-by-sides, high-powered rifles, all those sorts of things? Would they have made those same decisions about an unlimited harvest? No, because nobody could even dream of those sorts of things at that point. So they made
or millions of people in cities, highways, rail, resource development, the oil sands projects themselves, those sorts of things. So yeah, definitely, like, hundreds of years ago, who would have forecast that? If they had, there probably would have been provisions in a treaty around, you know, conservation. Like you have these harvesting rights as long as, you know, the moose or the animals are there, but then there's an obligation to make sure that they're available there, which is some of the stuff that's being played out in the courts right now. I know the Heyde decision in British Columbia a few years ago was found in favor of the Blueberry River First Nation, that the government like abdicated his responsibility to ensure that there were places and animals to hunt. You can have the right to hunt and trap, but there is also an obligation that comes with that the species has to be there in huntable abundance. So, yeah, that's just it's a complicated world relying on some of these commitments that were made.
And you
hundreds
said,
of years
Mark,
ago.
hundreds of years ago. That's not necessarily at all where I would go. It was 127 years ago. That's not that long ago.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And
No, true.
when you look at in the province of Alberta, if you go back to 2005, the data that I have showed a moose population estimate of 140,000 moose. And I know what the outfitting harvest was. It impacted probably one moose in 170. The resident harvest between cows, calves, and bulls was somewhere between 8-9% of the total moose population. It looked like we had everything that we could possibly ask for, except we had no idea about the First Nations harvest. But everything seemed to be fairly solid at that point. In 20 years, Mark, it's crashed. I didn't believe that we had the capacity as a society to do that in such a short period of time. And one of the reasons why, in my mind, is because we think we can continue to do things as we did 125 years ago. We can't. There are no longer huge areas that are undisturbed for moose to congregate in. There are we have the capacity to gather data, but we're not getting the stuff that we need. I know that you mentioned on the podcast that I listened to this morning that we've turned to a system where the wildlife managers are simply managing the resident harvest, and that's not working. And yet we continue to do that.
Yeah.
We have to come up with something much better than that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It seems to be a common theme across the country. Now, specifically, like, let's explain the sign project a bit more, the component of this. You showed it on here. So folks that are listening to the podcast, so Bob showed like an example of a sign. It's got a cow moose on it. It says protect the cow moose, a little bit more information. And I know there's a variety of sizes of different signs, like up to like almost billboard stuff to things that can go on a community bulletin board. So what is the sign project? Who puts them up? Where do they put them up? What's the goal of the sign project? So on and so on. Can people get signs to put up?
Perfect. So, as someone who has spent the last year and a half trying to do this, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have somebody ask me this so that I can say it out loud to your thousands and thousands of loyal listeners. First of all, I'll go back to Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons is the guy that started the whole thing in British Columbia. And when I talked to him 2 weeks ago, Dan said that it's almost $250,000 worth of signs have been spent, or dollars have been spent on signs in British Columbia, which totals up to 1,500 signs, and they're everywhere. There are billboard signs. There's a whole bunch of little poster sticky signs. They do stuff in schools. They're going everywhere they can, and the reason that they're doing it is because they believe it works. If you get the message out to people that this is how we can have a sustainable moose future, if people can understand that, if they can be provided that information, then people are willing to follow along with it. So we have APOS has generated signs, t-shirts like what you're wearing, hats. People can purchase them. You can buy little signs, you can buy big signs. I have them up at the post office in Gerrard. We have them up at the Honda shop. Our little girl, who's the rodeo queen in High Prairie, has one on her horse trailer, so she can take that where she goes with the rodeo stuff. The message is to get or the idea is to get the message out to people that we have to protect cows and calves, and we have to do it as fast as we can. You can contact APOS for um, to purchase signs or to buy T-shirts or those sorts of things. I find that the message that we did when the website was created to support it is too generic. It doesn't seem to create, in my mind, this fear of how bad the situation is. I guess I went to the doctor this morning, and he had probably the capacity to say to me that I have a very bad decision for you, or a very bad piece of information for you. Nobody wants to hear that. But if you're not going to listen to that, or if you don't want to hear it, how in the world can you address the issue and solve the problem? You can't. If there's bad news, we need to open our ears and listen, and we need to hear the fact that moose populations are crashing, but there's a solution, and it's working elsewhere. So we should at least give it an honest effort here in Alberta. So by all means, folks can contact the Alberta Professional Outfitter Society. We have a website. Um, I want to.
I think the cow moose sign project is like a drop down menu of on the Alberta Professional Outfitters website, is it not?
It could be. It could be.
I'm pretty sure it is. I'll double check. I can put the link in the show notes for folks.
Yeah, and we want to get that message out everywhere where it's possible. We know that you mentioned it earlier, and it can be a kind of a controversial subject. If folks have an opportunity, they should Google Williams Lake Cow Moose Sign Project. And there are about half a dozen First Nations leaders from the Williams Lake area that talk about their commitment to supporting this initiative in order to bring the moose back. And Chief Willie Sellers is one of the ones that struck me, a very articulate, intelligent man. And I have a chance to speak with him on Monday next week to find out what sort of fears and worries did his people have when he brought the idea forward. What is it that First Nations people genuinely, when you said, we've opened up our hearts before to the government and had them stabbed, we don't want to have that happen again. I want to know from Chief Sellers what his recommendations would be in Alberta to help promote this. But we have already seen a number of First Nations communities in Alberta say, yes, we see the problem, we're going to support that. And we want to enable those communities to be as strong and powerful as we can. And the rest of us as well. Again, like you said, where we have very solid moose populations in the southern part of the province, nobody should feel concerned about drawing the moose tag. And I've spoken to our minister here about saying that up in the north, there should be no cow moose tags, in my humble opinion. And I'm not a wildlife manager, and I know that, but we have areas where there's tags available, adjacent to areas that are clearly crashed. Let those populations grow. Let them spill over a little bit. And but the sign project allows us to identify that there's a problem and promote some sort of an immediate solution that all of us can be a part of. And that's the educational component and encouraging people to let the cows and calves go.
Right. Okay. No, it makes sense because, in the field of change management, if you ask people to do something differently, and you just impose the change on them, physics kicks in, and for every force, there's a equal and opposite force, right? Whatever the physics law is there, people push back against it. But when you take steps towards asking people to change, and the first part of it is people just need to be aware that there is a need to change. So what you're saying is the awareness is like, hey folks, these moose populations in the north aren't looking so good. You just need to be aware of that. And then from that becomes a desire to change, going, oh, okay, I didn't know. Now I know. What can I do to make a difference? And then you move through the process of change management. So am I correct in saying like the signs are maybe the first part? It's you're making people aware that there's an issue and that there's a need to harvest differently in protecting the cow moose.
You're exactly right. In order to really bite into that, you want to have something that's going to show you that, yes, we are in a crash. And I spent weeks going through harvest data and population estimates. When I asked APOS for a population estimate that the provincial government supplied, they sent an Excel spreadsheet that was 26 pages long. Across the top, there was years 2010 to 2024, so 14 rows or 14 columns. On the bottom, there was 150 wildlife management units. Well, you can't do that on one page, so it turns out to be 26 pages of data. And when you took page 14, there was no page number on the bottom, nor did it have the dates across the top or the wildlife management units down the bottom. It was some innocuous set of numbers. I went through all of that and I graphed it so it was easy to understand. And I think somebody that's pretty good with Excel could probably do that in about a heartbeat and put all that information so it's easy to understand. There's no value in me saying to people, I want you to trust me because I'm an intelligent man who cares about moose. So you know that I won't lie to you about what the populations are doing. If somebody's going to say that to me, I'm going to call BS on that. I want to have some data. So then I looked at the data and said, well, we only have half of what we need to make statements like that in the north because it hasn't been surveyed. So people are going to have to do some digging if they're going to get enough data or enough information to be able to say, yep, I agree. Or else they can go out hunting with somebody who's hunted there 30 years ago and say, is this what you remember? You know, did you ever used to see more than 2 moose in a week? There's that. But I think we have to be a little bit braver than just say that's the first part of what we have to do. We have to promote the non-harvest of cows and calves. And it's very easy to point, and I'm going to take objection to something that you said this morning or that I heard on your podcast. Maybe, Mark, I shouldn't blame you for saying it because you had another guest. But I think you were the one that said we need to hold those politicians to account. They're the people that were hired to do this job, and they damn well need to do the job, and they're not doing it. Well, I understand where you're going with that, but you know what? I think we need to look at ourselves and say, if I understand what this problem is, I have a role to play in this too. And maybe it's, if you think that, well, I'm not harvesting a cow moose, so I'm doing my role, that's not enough anymore. We need to do far more than that. I did not believe 2 years ago that a little outfitter in Salt Prairie, Alberta, who knows very little about biology, I did not believe that I would ever be in a position where I'm talking to you, where I'm talking to First Nations people, where I'm talking to the government. I didn't think one person could be that impactful. And I've been humbled and very much motivated by the fact that, yeah, you can.
Yeah, no, that's a good message in itself, because I think a lot of people feel self-defeated that one voice can't make a difference, and maybe one voice can't, but one voice inspires some more and some more and some more and some more, for sure. Definitely, I still kind of stand, behind the fact that in North America, we have this model that wildlife are held in trust by the people that we elect and put into position of governments to administer the resource, which is the wildlife. So unless we want to change that, and the alternative in North America is privatization of wildlife, which I don't think anybody wants to go down that route. That's the African model, that's the European model, and it cuts the average person's access to wildlife out. So we still have to embrace this public trust model, and we do have to hold the people that we elect to lead us and make our laws accountable for that. Where we need to step up in that is to say, we're seeing a problem. We don't like the current system. And even if the grassroots movement has to be, well, then, we're going to start taking charge. And you need to buy into where the people want want to go with a moose program. I think that's part of it. So that's kind of where I was coming from when I made that statement, or whoever made that statement. I don't remember.
And I'm not going to throw you under the bus, because one of the other statements that you did make, and I believe, again, it was you that made it, and this one I agree with, is that the Supreme Court is the one that we seem to be leaning on to make those decisions for us. And they don't care about moose. They care about, I forget exactly the terms that you put it in, but it's about making the decisions that seem to be consistent with what law would say. And I think that those of us who have a passion about wildlife need to say, you know what, first of all, when you say about the elected leaders, our Supreme Court people are not elected leaders. And
no, I'm elected leaders. I mean the people that we vote in for government.
I understand where you're going with that, and I agree with that to a point. We need to leverage those people as much as we can. But there are decisions being made there that have totally handicapped our wildlife managers. If I was one of those people, I would throw my hands up in the air too and say, well, how can I possibly do this job? So what we need is people like Dan Simmons who have a vision and who are willing to say, I'm going to step outside my comfort level and I'm going to go out and do the things that I think it's going to make a difference. And God bless the fact that there are people like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes sense. Now, so two things, kind of coming back to the rights harvesters. The message here is not to stop hunting, correct? Like, don't hunt moose at all. The message is, from a moose conservation and sustainability perspective, let's shift the focus to bulls, which we can harvest bulls a little bit more intensively and protect cows and have a population that can stabilize or recover it. We can still have a human harvest if that harvest is skewed towards males. Is that fair?
Absolutely correct. And you and I both know that if we were to take and slam the bulls to as hard as we possibly can, then we're going to have another issue there. But for right now, let's deflect the pressure off the cows. Let's put it on the bulls. They can take a little bit more. And
so go ahead. So part of the challenge, I would assume, with this is, I think for folks like myself, we've grown up in a culture where we mostly harvest males. We're interested in antlers, the big mature animals, later age animals, a lot of the emphasis around that. For Indigenous communities around the world, it's about food, and it's about the most valuable food component, which, at least in North America, has always been the female of the species. And archaeologists have been, saying that for years, and it's just straight outright biology. One, there's more of them, but it also has to do with body fat. And in the prime of their years, in the prime of the fall, a female animal will have a higher percentage of body fat than a male, especially when, our mating season for those animals is also in the fall. And fat and marrow is where most of your nutrition comes from. So the value is always in harvesting as much fat as possible, which the hunting culture built around the emphasis of hunting, and hunting the females. I understood it from Jack Brink, who was an archaeologist that worked on we had him on a podcast on the head smashed in buffalo jump thing. Like, he echoed the same thing. The interest was in harvesting the females because of higher body fat component. And when the Europeans came along and they wanted to go on these guided hunts, and it was sort of like they would have Indigenous people, guiding, and they'd be like, "Why do you want to harvest that big old bull?" Right? Like, there was a cultural gap,
Yep.
Right? So I've learned to appreciate the fact that what I've been taught is hunting, and sustainable hunting fits my culture, but that's not the culture of many Indigenous peoples. It's like, no, we harvest females. That's what hunting means to us. So now we step in, and we're also kind of asking for this shift from females to bull harvest And that's a cultural nuance there as well. What has been your experience in asking somebody that's fundamentally different to your culture and what hunting is to shift to the male of the species?
I don't think that my experience in the First Nations communities that I've taught has led me to believe that they would choose to shoot a cow over a bull. I think
Okay.
that what I've seen is that they will shoot the first animal that's available to them. You're probably quite
Yep.
right in the cows being,
Utility.
yeah, the cows maybe being somewhat more desirable, but um, most of the folks that I knew in Gift Lake when I first started there made dry meat, and you slice a moose up as thin as you can and let it, air dry or whatever, or smoked or whatever. I'm not sure that would make a difference if it was a bull or a cow. I really don't know the biology
Okay.
well enough
Okay.
to do it. But I would
Yeah.
say that for most of the folks that if they had a shot at a moose, especially if it was one that was easy to get at, so they didn't have to really fight hard to get their groceries, that would be the first one that they'd shoot.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I
I'm
don't,
I'm I'm approaching 60 this year, and that's my mindset. It's like no more. There's a big one on the top of the mountain, and there's a small one down here,
yeah,
100 yards off the side of the
sucks to
road.
be a little guy.
My yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I don't, I don't,
Um,
I don't think that that's going to be an issue. I can see where, for some people, they might make it one, but the essence of it is we can't continue to do the same thing that we're doing.
yeah,
Otherwise, we're not going to
yeah.
have anything.
And we need a collective approach, which I very much hear in the ethos of what you're talking about, in bringing everybody to the table to have these open discussions and a vision about where everybody wants to go. And of course, it's the moose. Everybody, regardless of your upbringing, your culture, whatever, more moose on the landscape is not necessarily, I think, what people are against, no matter where you come from. I want you to touch a little bit on some of the programs, and I remember in December you presented on a cultural camp that the Métis harvesters were. I think this would be year 2 or 3 coming up this fall, where they're embracing the concept of moose management and shifting towards the bull harvest, but they're getting kids involved and they got these camps and that's being supported by different organizations. Maybe tell us that story.
That was there. There have been a number of things that have touched my heart on this whole journey, and excuse me, and that was obviously one of them as well. I did a presentation at the River Cree Casino in whatever they call it, convention center, and I was having breakfast with some folks there, and somebody was wearing a moose cap or a hoodie with moose cap on it, and I chatted with the gentleman.
Oh, right, right,
He
right.
he was
Yeah.
he was from the Elizabeth Métis settlement. His name was Wayne Solway, and he, together with I don't know half a dozen or 10 other folks, whatever, from the community, decided that the children in the community were not getting the instruction that they needed on harvesting, on the cultural parts of it, on the whole aspect of being a native person out in the bush. And they didn't know where to turn to get that or to provide that for their kids. So they said, well, we'll do it. And so a number of those members said, let's get a bunch of the kids from the community. We'll take them out for a week-long harvesting moose hunting thing. It's not a cultural camp, it's a moose hunting camp. And they did that the first year, and they were very excited about it. The next year, they had 30. And the last year, they had 30 students as well. Now, I'm a school teacher by profession. I've taken kids on field trips. But you take 30 kids out in the bush for a week. Holy cow, do you have your hands full? And you've made a heck of a commitment. And
Little alone you're going hunting where
oh,
everybody kind of needs to be quiet.
yeah, right, for sure. So I was able to sit with Wayne and our managing director at that point and say, look, for people who are making this commitment, this is the first one that I've heard of. I'm sure it's not the first one in history or anything like that. But if these folks from the Métis settlement here are taking the steps to promote one of their messages was, we don't shoot cows or calves. It's just strictly bull harvest. If they're doing that and if they're educating kids, that's our future. Is there some way that we can find funding for that? So we were able to get two different sources of funding for that, for which they were very grateful. This year, Wayne said to me that they're going to try to tap the shoulders of 7 other Métis settlements and have 5 of their kids come forward. So they would be taking representatives from all of the Métis settlement general councils. And I'm in close proximity to several of them, and I'm going to try to reach out to those people and say, look, that's the future for your kids. You either do that or it's going to be lost. There is hunter education available in the province of Alberta. I'm sure there is in British Columbia as well. You can do ours online. That would be nothing compared to spending a week with experienced hunters and your peers in the woods and doing that. And so we really want to promote that. Um, in the discussions that we've had with several of the other First Nations communities in Alberta, they've recognized that there's a real lack of education for young people.
Yeah, yeah.
You take the Métis Nation of Alberta people who 20 years ago, or let's say 15 years ago, had to take a hunter training course before they could buy a license. Once they had that, then they could, of course, obviously buy a license every year. But for 15 years now, there have been people from the Métis Nation of Alberta that could quite conceivably have gone out in the woods with very little knowledge or training or teaching or anything like that. That's a huge mistake on our part. We can't just assume people had that knowledge because of their culture or where they grew up or who their dad was or whatever like that. Um, we need to really promote the education part of it as well, and we've seen good support from that from the communities that we've talked to so far.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. I remember seeing the pictures in your presentation of moose camp and the kids that were there, and the sort of the adult to kid ratio and stuff. And yeah, like a moose hanging in camp and kids, helping skin and break the meat down and whatnot. And I just remember you talking about like the first camp was kind of like, they cobbled together like some money to pay for fuel and the food and stuff. And then the next year, the demand from families and kids to participate had grown immensely around that, and kind of shows the importance of that there still is, even in this day and age of phones and computers and whatnot, that there's still this fundamental underlying desire to get out to a camp with family, with friends, and be back on the land and do stuff. So it was some great pictures. I believe, if I remember this right, the Alberta Professional Outfitter Society helped fund some of those first couple youth camps from the Métis.
That's correct. And we also had good support from the Great Lakes Dallas Safari Club chapter as well.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, that's that's amazing. And I guess like the idea from the Métis harvesters is like, get a template, get something, and then that, like when you become successful, then other communities are like, hey, that looks pretty cool. Can you tell us how you did that? And then it grows from there. So
it's one of the questions that I'm looking forward to asking Chief Sellers. In the years that he's been supporting Dan Simmons with the Williams Lake First Nation, supporting the Calmoose Sign campaign, what other activities have they done to promote that whole message? Education. I'm really proud of the folks out at Elizabeth. Great people doing a great job. I'll bet there's more of that, and we're just not aware of it. That's why it's so wonderful to have people like you who dig through all the cracks and pull out people like me and the other ones, so we can get that message out there.
Oh, that's how I learn things is having these conversations with folks like yourself. Now, what can like people do? Like, let's like focus on, say, like the resident hunter, Alberta citizens. What can they do? How can they get involved? Can they get their own signs? Can they put them up on their driveways? Can they, is there financial support? Can people do in-kind donations? Like people sort of like, they go, this sounds cool. What can I do to help?
So,
what's the message for folks?
When we first did this, APOS provided the Métis Settlement General Council signs, and we had 4x8 road signs that they could put up, and we had 3 for each of the 8 settlements. And then we made it available for outfitters to purchase at a somewhat subsidized cost. And the uptake was little. It was disappointing. But there's a highway that I travel between here and Edmonton, and I was coming home from the presentation that I had done in Edmonton, and lo and behold, there was one of our signs. And I got an email from somebody right after I got home that they had driven past that sign and they wanted one. And all of a sudden, we recognized that, yeah, it does make a difference. People see that. People like the message. They can put it up. So obviously, the best thing that you can do is to talk with people who are in a position to harvest an unlimited number of cows and calves, and to try to explain to people like that there are other options and why that shouldn't take place. Most of us don't have that skill set or that opportunity to do that, but all of us can buy a sign and put it someplace. And if we have the opportunity to talk to people about why this is important and, what the data shows, a sign is a very easy way to do it. And like I said, Dan Simmons said they have 1,600 or 1,500 signs across BC. You don't go very many places that you don't save the cow moose sign project thing. And that has an impact. It's hard to measure, I'm sure, and I know we had an outfitter from close to where I live and said, you put up a sign here, it's going to be full of holes in no time. I've got one 2 miles from where I live. It's right where you enter the woods there. I'm going to drive by it today, and I'll bet there's not one bullet hole in it. And there are hundreds of people that drive by that sign every day. Hopefully it causes people to think and to talk, and we're not only going to try to do, obviously, the physical signs, but the electronic signs, put stuff on, build
okay, yep,
on digital stuff.
The big Jimmy Pattison ones on the highway or whatever.
Well, those ones, but also like, every community has a website, and put it on the website, and something that people can see, and just to try to reach out. And, I'm very limited with my skills. You know that because I was 10 minutes late getting on here because I had to learn how to turn the computer on. There are lots of people who have access to those technological skills that could really help promote that. If you don't feel comfortable, putting up a sign, but you have another skill set that can help promote this project, everything is appreciated and welcomed. And my information, I'm sure you'll get it from me at the end or whatever. People can feel free to contact me by phone or by email. The Alberta Professional Outfitter Society is easily reached as well, and they'll help people, get them steered on to how they can purchase signs or T-shirts or hats or other promotional material. And we launched this campaign through APOS August the 9th last year, so we're not a year into it yet. And
wow,
yeah, so we've made some really good progress. We need some more people that are willing to flog signs and to travel and to generate ideas and go to schools and do presentations and those sorts of things. We're open to all of that sort of stuff because one person by themselves doesn't get very much done. But like you said, one person can influence another, and pretty soon you have a team, and pretty soon you have a whole uniform of people.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I remember this saying from years ago. We're at a day and age where conservation requires everybody. Conservation is not just some field project and putting a collar on a captured animal, or whatever. It is marketing. It is social media. It is somebody that can make graphics, somebody that can pull together presentations, somebody that's a photographer, somebody that's a videographer, yada, 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 yada. Every single skill set out there in some way, shape, or form can play a role in conservation like this Save the Cow Moose project in Alberta. It just requires people to know that you don't have to be a wildlife biologist. You don't have to be a like whatever, you may have something that can help. So don't ever discount if it's in your heart and this is something that's of interest and you want to go, gee, I wonder how I could help. Reach out to Dan. We'll put his contact information in the show notes, because everybody can help, even if it's a sign or talking to people or whatever, up to somebody that's a filmmaker or a graphics designer or something. Yeah. So excellent. Hey, one of the last things I wanted to touch on here, and this may be the most challenging question of all. I want to be cognizant that there's folks that are listening to this that aren't hunters. They don't come from that background. They're just interested in the conversation and what's going on in their province. When we talk about animal populations are declining, there's a concern across the board, so on and so on. To me, one of the first questions that's going to come into, and it's a logical thought, why are you hunting at all? If there's a concern of a population, why not just stop all hunting and allow the animals to recover? It's like, I have my thoughts around it. It's different in different cases. There's obviously a point, the endangered caribou populations in BC and Alberta, they reached a dangerously low threshold where everybody stopped. First Nations stopped harvesting, even though they constitutionally could. The government shut down hunting. It's like, but we're not there yet. We're not, we have declining populations, but we're not at the point where, federally or provincially, they're going to list moose as an endangered or threatened species. We don't want to get there. But folks are saying, why not remove, hunting out of that picture until such a time? So what would you say to the non-hunter that's listening to say, this is why some harvesting isn't hurting here if it's the bull harvest, or does hunting even have an impact?
I think
if it's just on the bulls.
You would be very proud to know that I paid attention to what I listened to on this morning's podcast. And I think
I gotta send you you're a school teacher. I'm gonna send you some gold stars for your chart. So this is amazing.
I'm gonna try to paraphrase what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was that licensed, monitored, regulated hunting, if you want to call it that, has never been the cause of the decline of wildlife. Do you remember saying something like that?
Yep, I think I've said that before.
Okay, good, because that's what I thought I heard. And I wanted to say to mine is that if there is no mechanism to monitor and control the harvest of free-ranging fish, birds, and wildlife, we have the capacity in our society to do serious harm to that. But at the same time, we live in this world together with those animals, and we should never think that they can exist now without involvement from us. That's a pipe dream. That's a long time ago. That's hundreds of years ago. We have too many roads. We have too many bridges. We have too many dams. We have too many things that impact wildlife. And if we don't play an active role in their longevity, they can't exist. There's no natural balance left for most of the species anymore. There's just too many other factors in there. And hunting is one of those things that wildlife managers can do to keep populations in a healthy state. It's a very sad thing. Well, we saw it this winter. Up north here, we had huge amounts of snow. And when you see animals that are starving to death, you can say it's nature's way. It's a cruel and really, it's a terrible way for an animal to die. I think for most people in society, we would rather if the populations were kept healthy so that animals didn't have to go through that. And hunting plays a very valuable role like that. Not only, I want to go back to the outfitting thing a little bit because I haven't touched on that, and I'm a member of the Alberta Professional Outfitters Society. Alberta outfitters bring people from around the world to experience what we have in Alberta. And when you get to a resource, let's say like moose, for example, we know that there's limited numbers and maybe we shouldn't be taking people in from the rest of the world when we don't have enough to feed ourselves as much as we want. One of the things that the outfitting world does is that it allows people from different communities and different cultures and different countries to come and experience what we have, and thereby allows us to reciprocate. And we can go and see other places and harvest other species and learn other things. There were some states in the United States a number of years that got into a pissing match with each other, and well, we're not going to let this. We're not going to let anybody come in and hunt deer over here because they won't let us over there like that. We can have that approach too. But I like to hunt or to harvest salmon. I would like to catch a big halibut or maybe to go hunt a caribou somewhere. I went to Africa. By going to those places, you learn a lot. And we should always have an open mind in the value of having people being brought to this province to enjoy what we have. We have enough to share, a small amount. Um, it's a livelihood. It's a thing that's existed since 1887. It's been around for a long time. There have been all kinds of different communities of people that have been involved, and that's a very important role too. So hunting as a part, whether it's the professional outfitters who provide that service to people outside, or whether it's licensed resident harvesters, or whether it's First Nations people, it's a huge way of gaining protein for our bodies, for our families. It's um, it provides people an experience that you only get by being there in the outdoors. I know that because you're a moose hunter, you've had the thrill of the moose hunt. That's pretty precious stuff, and we don't want to lose that. Um, for anybody that's a non-hunter, it's easy to understand why they would have a concern because we're killing animals that we really love. Um, but sometimes that has to take place so that the rest of them can live as well. If we don't take some out, then they're all going to die. So your point is well said. I certainly have had an open mind to people who don't hunt. I don't force that on people. I made a living doing that. Um, I've made a living teaching kids school, and there are some of them that suggested that I shouldn't have been forcing them to go to school either. But we we see the value in all those sorts of things if we have an open mind and participate a little bit, and we can see, if you look at the facts and the science and all that, it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's those are all, very good points. I think um the piece that I would layer on top of that when it comes to the conservation of any species, moose is our topic here. We need everybody who cares about moose to help when there's a conservation concern, when there's solutions that we know we can implement and make a difference. And I think this picture with the moose, and we've touched on this, this is bigger in Alberta than just not harvesting some cows in areas where the populations are declining. It's about all these other impacts that we talk to and limiting those, and society having to make choices for those. They need to understand what the implications of a gondola or a resort or, a new golf course or an addition to a highway is going to have on the moose, because those are permanent changes. We can change, our harvesting quotas and licenses and stuff, but those changes we can't. And in order for moose to benefit from that, everybody who cares, that has a vested interest, needs to be part of the solutions. For me, allowing some people in our province to have access to catch a fish, to harvest a moose, the opportunity to harvest a moose, to trap, keeps those people involved. They have intimate knowledge of the landscape. They see the year-to-year changes. They do care about the broad population trends. We don't want to lose those people. And if you just say no hunting, that's a large portion of people that are just going to walk away, and they're going to walk away with a lot of hours of knowledge and interest. And to me, if you're interested in moose, and you want to be part of a conservation solution, to me, it doesn't matter how you get there. But if you care, then everybody cares for their own reasons. If you're a wildlife photographer, if you're a hunter, doesn't matter. You're there having these conversations of how society can stabilize or increase moose populations. And so it's not quite as simple as just saying stop hunting, because then you run the risk of taking a whole bunch of people whose time, efforts, money, and resources, like APOS, like yourself, out of the picture. And then who's going to pick that up? Who's going to pick that slack up? And one of the examples is, you talked about your industry bringing people in from outside the country. I think for our last podcast, it was very clear to me that it's like the outfitter harvest in Alberta is pretty tiny in the whole grand scheme of things. I got 2 mule deer allocations, and I've had the same one for the same unit since they were first allocated back in the 90s. There's been no changes, no increases. It's a small percentage of the picture, but every year down in Salt Lake City, a hunter, usually from the United States, is at the auction when the Minister's Special Moose tag comes up, and there's somebody that bids on that opportunity to come to Alberta to harvest a moose from this province that pays 2, 3, 4 times the going rate of just calling an outfitter and asking for a moose hunt, because want to give back to conservation, and that money goes in to benefit way more moose. That's the value of having hunters involved in hunting. When there is a little bit of harvest to be had that's still sustainable, it's keeping people involved that are bringing money, knowledge, and energy to the table. So that's kind of my take on it.
That's pretty consistent with what I heard this morning from you too, Mark.
Wow. Bob, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show, being very open, honest, and frank about your conversation around this topic, and I think the single biggest message I want to restate that I think is one of the most powerful things I heard today is a single voice can make a difference. That's evident here. You've probably got hundreds and hundreds of people now that are getting around this vision and looking for bits and pieces, and it may go in different directions, but at the end of the day, you've inspired a whole bunch of people to say, hey, I think there's a problem here. And some people are going, we see that too. Let's make life better for moose in the province of Alberta. So, don't ever be scared, folks, to do what Bob did, to just be in that empty room and going, well, I'm looking around. I'm the only one here to put up my hand and say, I'm going to try to make a difference. So thank you for being in that room by yourself and tasking yourself with the only action item from your meeting. So good on you. Any final thoughts you want to leave with folks about the Cow Moose Project in Alberta?
Yeah, Mark, I would say that we need to get in touch in 6 months or a year from now, because I'm anticipating big improvements in the next little while. We've got our feet in the dirt now, and now we're going to start to push. So it would be exciting to hear what we can come up with in that time frame.
Absolutely. What I would love to do is to make a drive to northern Alberta, meet up with you, and maybe go on some of these sites, go to some of your meetings, maybe the moose camp, get some visuals and some video footage and carry the story on that way by reporting from boots on the ground with you. So
sounds good.
Awesome. Great conversation, folks. If you're interested in the Cow Moose Project, I'll drop a link into the show notes down below, as well as Bob's. I'll put your email, maybe not your phone number, but I'll put that there because he did offer reach out, questions, comments, or most importantly, saying, hey, I'd like to help out in any way that I can. What could I do? I think that's also a strong message from this show. So thanks, Bob, and thanks for listening, everyone. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Mark.